Two in one day. So this video, the most credible alien encounter. What I'm going to do, I'm going to read to you from a book. I own a copy of it, and I really love this book. It is by a man named Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. He is, I think the guy's a genius. He has a PhD in patristics from Oxford University. This is not a very well-known field, but it's a very interesting field. It's actually a multidisciplinary field. It's the study of the Church Fathers. So it's basically the study of the deep state, because basically what the Church Fathers were and continue to be. So it's the study of languages, theology, finance, politics, very broad, even science. So his book is called Nazi International. So highly, I hope this doesn't get pulled off for the logo. Highly recommend it. So the subtitle of this book is The Nazis' Post-War Plan to Control Finance, Conflict, Physics, and Space. Space, which is central to the point of this video. So he's written several excellent books. Highly recommend it. So what he lays the groundwork for this whole scenario of the Nazi International and their involvement with space in this book. One of the first things he does, he shows what's called the instrument of surrender. The instrument of surrender, it's a legal document, it's a treaty that ends a war. So one side surrenders to the other, signs an agreement saying, we're done. You've bested us, you've won. So this is a legal document. Now, the thing with law that is not taught on the television news, nothing is implied in law. So you have to write what you mean. And if you don't specify something in a document, it doesn't exist. That's just how law works. You have to make your documents watertight. You have to express all of the meanings that you want to convey to the other party. You have to express exactly what you want. If you don't express what you want and you're not provided with something that you feel you're entitled to, you can't say, oh, well, what I meant was this, this, and this, so you need to give me what I meant to say. Well, there's no what you meant to say in law or in court. It's all very specific. And if you fuck up and you sign a document that's not specific, it's not precise, and it doesn't give you what you want, you just shafted yourself. So this instrument of surrender, there were two instruments of, well, there are multiple instruments of surrender in World War II. So in Europe, the government of Germany, German military signed two, and there was one signed by the Japanese. Now, in both of these treaties, these instruments of surrender signed by the Germans, there's absolutely no mention of the Nazi Party. You can look this up. All the document says is that the German military high command and the government surrenders to the Allies. There's absolutely no mention of the Nazis and the SS or any of that stuff. So they never surrendered. The SS, the Nazis, they were parasites. They used Germany as a host. They manipulated it. They took control of it. They got it destroyed. And then they left. And they ran away. They went to South America. They definitely came to the United States. They were welcomed into NASA, into the military. They helped found CIA, NSA. They built the modern medical system, the airlines, the highways, so many things. Built so much technology, gave America a lot of know-how. There's documentary evidence that shows they went to South America. And it's plausible they even built some kind of base in Antarctica. So the Nazis and the SS never surrendered and they got away. And there's a lot of evidence that strongly suggests that they built far superior technology to anything anyone else in the world had, and that's still far superior to the state of the art today. So what I want to get into here, well, actually, in just a little more background. So it hasn't been universally, the universal consensus does not make room for this idea that the Nazis got away, even though, you know, the truth is in our faces. So, and after the war, there were, you know, neo-Nazi organizations that kept the the memory of the Nazis and the SS alive and kept their sort of mythologies going. So there was a what was his name? Wilhelm Landig was an SS veteran, and he wrote the Thule trilogy. He wrote one in the 70s, one in the 80s, and he wrote the last in 1990. And it was about the continuation of this Nazi power structure. So I'm going to read a passage from this book. It's going to make references to Wilhelm Landig. He was a Nazi SS veteran science fiction author. Okay. So, yeah. Get a snack for this, because I'm going to read out of the book. It's going to take a little while. Okay. So, page 29 of the Nazi International comes to an account of UFO contact. Now, this is one of the first documented encounters in modern America with UFOs. It took place on 1957 in November. What was the date? November the 5th. So this was actually much more down to earth than any UFO alien contact incident that happened after it. And it involved an American citizen. His name was Reinhold O. Schmidt. He was a first generation German American from Nebraska. The incident happened in Kansas. He was from Nebraska, and he was a farm broker, so he traveled. And when he was traveling on a business trip, he had this encounter. Now, an important thing about him, he spoke both English and German, because in his school growing up, they also taught German. He grew up in a German enclave, in an ethnic enclave. Okay, so we get to this section on page 29. Curious incident, Reinhard Schmidt's contact with German-speaking UFO occupants. And I'm just going to read through this. I'll try to make minimal commentary. As if to reinforce all this high strangeness surrounding Nazis and UFOs, a Nebraska farm broker and German-American, Reinhold O. Schmidt, had an extremely unusual UFO encounter. He claimed to have been contacted by occupants of a cigar-shaped UFO who spoke German. Of course, contactees all over the world report hearing such alleged occupants as speaking their own language or communicating with humans telepathically. So there is nothing unusual or significant in this fact alone. However, for his efforts, Mr. Schmidt was rewarded with a stint in a psychiatric clinic. Furthermore, in an article in a West German newspaper reporting the incident, the U.S. Air Force was apparently somewhat concerned about the event. Reinhold O. Schmidt's actual account. Schmidt's actual account of his contact, however, deserves closer scrutiny, for it is divided into two distinct parts. The first, dealing with his initial contact, and the second, dealing with subsequent contacts. Regarding the second part of Schmidt's own account, would convince anyone that the man may have been more than a little out there, as he recounts journeys with his German-speaking space brothers to Russia, the North Pole, where he is feted to an early lecture on the dangers of global warming, and to the Great Pyramid of Giza, where the leader of the Space Brothers, a Mr. X, uses a laser beam-like device to gain entry into secret chambers inside the structure. But the first part of his story, the first part of his short autobiographical account of his initial contact, the Reinhold O. Schmidt story, Cosmic Secrets Exposed, The Edge of Tomorrow, the true account of experiences with visitors from another planet, presents a far more sobering picture, for it details his initial contact with 6 German-speaking UFO occupants near Kearney, Nebraska on November 5th, 1957. Schmidt's account has about it the air of plausibility for 2 reasons. The first being that he was a careful observer of what he saw, and the second because what he saw was clearly technological, but a technology not exotic enough to compel to the conclusion that it originated off this planet. Very important. I'm going to get more into that. Okay, back to the book. The malfunctioning ignition in a Nazi and fascist parallel. Schmidt begins by noting that after seeing a brilliant flash of light while driving back from work during the night, that his car engine suddenly stopped. He turned the ignition off and on several times, but to no avail. Malfunction of automobile electrical systems is, of course, a common feature of UFO encounters and can be rationalized on the basis of conventional science as a result of an electromagnetic pulse or exposure to strong electromagnetic fields that basically short out electrical equipment in their vicinity. But I've also pointed out in my previous book, Secrets of the Unified Field, such devices were allegedly part of the secret weapons project of both fascist Italy and of Nazi Germany. Thus, the conjunction of German-speaking occupants of Schmidt's UFO and its strange effects on his car served to mutually corroborate the speculative possibility that Schmidt encountered some post-war descendant of those wartime secret projects. Schmidt's encounter with beings from another world can, in short, be scientifically rationalized by terrestrial technological antecedents. Next section, the pencil beam of light. The pencil thin beam of light. Schmidt then recounts that, having failed to turn his automobile engine back on, he exited his car and raised the hood, thinking perhaps that a wire had come loose. As he did so, he noticed a large craft that looked like a half-inflated balloon, but which was made of metal and which rested on 4 hydraulic rams serving as landing gear. As he drew near the object, a thin stream of light, about as big around as a pencil, shot out from it and hit me across the chest. It seemed as if I were suddenly paralyzed. I could not move. Maybe I was only scared stiff, but before I could analyze my feelings, a door in the ship slid open and 2 men came out of it toward me. Again, one notes the resemblance of Schmidt's technological description of the pencil-thin beam of light to a piece of wholly terrestrial technology that would become public knowledge in a few short years, the laser. The laser. While Schmidt is clear that his paralysis might have been his own emotional and physiological response to this, it is also clear that he implies that it was the result of being struck with the beam. While such a paralysis-inducing technology would have been extraordinarily sophisticated for the day, it is now known that the American military and intelligence services were working on methods of mind manipulation via technological and pharmaceutical means during the same time frame, so 1957-ish. We need only think of CIA's MKUltra project in this connection. Again, while sophisticated for the day, nothing in Schmidt's account thus far compels to the conclusion that his alleged encounter, if it indeed took place, represented contact with an extraterrestrial race, civilization, or technology. Next section, inside the ship. Shortly after this, Schmidt describes being invited into the ship by the leader of its 6 occupants, a man he calls Mr. X, in whom he describes as speaking English with a German accent. And this is from the account of Mr. Schmidt. Besides the leader, there were 3 men and 2 women in the ship. The women were sitting behind a big desk on which there was a large frame which enclosed what looked like a viewing screen. At the same end of the ship were 4 columns for colored liquid, red, green, blue, and orange. These tubes were approximately 4 1/2 feet high and 6 inches in diameter. The ladies seemed to be watching the liquid very closely as it moved slowly up and down, like the pistons in an automobile. The 3 men were working on an instrument panel that filled one side of the room. I saw one of them clipped off some short wires. The panel was filled with clocks, dials, buttons, and switches. In the center was a large screen which looked like our television screens, but it was not working while I was there. Wires, tubes, dials, clocks, switches, and colored liquid, being monitored by a crew of men and women. Schmidt's language is not evocative of advanced extraterrestrial technology, and in fact serves to underscore the possibility that Schmidt actually did encounter what he describes. As if to underscore this even further, Schmidt makes a fascinating and disturbing observation about the instrument panel itself. It had no name or indication that might have disclosed the place of manufacture. But I did notice some Arabic numerals. Arabic numerals are the numbers we use every day for, arithmetic, math class, all that stuff. But I did notice some Arabic numerals and some Roman numerals on it. However, there were no other figures or letters of any kind on either the inside or the outside of the ship. One would hardly expect on an advanced extraterrestrial craft to encounter Arabic and Roman numerals. Again, there's nothing exotic enough about the technology described to compel toward the conclusion that Schmidt had encountered something extraterrestrial in origin. In fact, the exact opposite is the case. He had encountered something extraordinary to be sure, but extraordinary precisely because every detail he elicits only serves to emphasize its human origins. Even Schmidt's descriptions, the odd way that the occupants seemed to glide rather than walk, can be wholly rationalized on the basis of a now well-known terrestrial technology. For most of those reading this book will have encountered teenagers gliding along a sidewalk or pavement on tennis shoes equipped with roller wheels. As if to highlight all the high strangeness of this unusual UFO contactee story, Schmidt makes the following observation. When these people spoke among themselves, they used High German, which I happen to understand as I graduated from a school in which both German and English were taught. I could speak, read, and understand it fairly well, but these people all spoke to me in English with a German accent. Schmidt, normally so careful an observer during the first part of his account, does not seem to ask nor answer the obvious questions. What were they talking about? Why did they assume he did not speak German? And most importantly, why were they speaking German? Why not Russian, French, Mandarin, Chinese, or Swahili? Why German? The implication of his assertions never seemed to have occurred to him, but they're clear. If true, he had witnessed some exotic terrestrial technology clearly tied to Germans in Germany. Next section, an intriguing observation. At this juncture, Schmidt then recounts how the leader, Mr. X, asked me if I knew anything about the United States satellite program. When I replied that I did not, he said, "They're planning to send up some satellites, but the first two will never leave the ground. The third will go up, but it won't send back data." The prophecy has since proved true. The results of these flights were printed in newspapers all over the country. True enough, but once again, the extraordinary implications of Schmidt's story seem to have escaped him. For America's satellite program at that point in history was highly classified. So again, November 1957. How did Schmidt's UFO occupants know about it? And more importantly, how did they know in advance what would happen with the first flights? Schmidt's Mr. X clearly has access to some inside knowledge. So, quick commentary. This incident allegedly took place November 1957. The month before, Sputnik 1 was launched by the Soviets successfully. Took a further 3 months for the US to launch Explorer 1. So it wasn't until February 1958 that the US put a satellite into orbit. So this Mr. X that he allegedly spoke to knew that the US was working to do that. Next section, departure. When the craft's crew finished whatever preparations they had been engaged in, they informed Mr. X once again in German that they were ready. And at this point, Mr. X informed Schmidt that he had to leave. As I stepped onto the ground, the motor started. It sounded like a large electrical one, and it became quieter as it worked up momentum. It ran a few seconds, and then the ship took off, straight up in the air. About 12 feet off the ground, it turned pitch black. Then at about 100 feet, it turned a bluish green and headed southwest. There was a brilliant flash, and then the ship absolutely disappeared before my eyes. I estimated the ceiling of the clouds that day to be about 800 feet, but the ship had vanished at about 150 feet. A county official told me later that the craft had stalled a tractor, 2 cars, and a large truck, all of which had been beneath the path of the ship during its takeoff. During my first visit aboard strange craft, I had been told not to try to start my car until the ship was out of sight, and that an attempt to do so would be unsuccessful. Now I realized why my car had stalled earlier when I first approached the ship. Other UFO contactee reports, of course, record similar features. But what is noteworthy here is that Schmidt describes a similar sight as witnesses describing the outdoor testing of the Nazi Bell device. And as I point out in my book, Secrets of the Unified Field, one and the same science can be used as a basis to explain and rationalize both the celebrated Philadelphia experiment and the alleged invisibility of the U.S. destroyer escort USS Eldridge, as well as the Nazi Bell. It is perhaps expedient to also point out that the Bell used a heavy maroon-violet liquid in the device, a fact loosely paralleled by the implications of Schmidt's observation of 4 colored liquids inside the UFO. Next section, the authorities get involved. Here we go. Schmidt quickly returned to Kearney, where he informed a local deputy sheriff of the whole episode. After the deputy informed Schmidt that an earlier siren during the daytime was because a local resident also reported seeing a strange object in the sky. Schmidt and the deputy returned to the spot along the Platte River where he had experienced his encounter. There they noticed the imprints of the 4 hydraulic rams on the dry bed of the Platte River in some oil of dark green color, fine textured and sweet smelling. Schmidt notably remarks, as he could not be positive that it came from the ship. The 2 men returned to Kearney and reported it all to the local police chief. The police chief then contacted the city attorney and a local newspaper reporter, and the 3 men, along with Schmidt and the deputy, returned to the site in a police cruiser with the siren going full blast all the way. The 4 imprints of the landing gear legs were still visible, as was the dark green oil. The deputy and Schmidt stepped off the distance between the landing gear imprints. We estimated the ship to be about 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. I guessed its height to be about 14 feet. Gathering up some of the oil for analysis, the group returned to Kearney, where Schmidt returned to his motel to watch television in the lobby. While watching a local program, it was suddenly interrupted by a news flash that a spaceship had landed in Kearney, Nebraska. Schmidt's reaction to this announcement is significant. I was very much surprised because nothing had been said to me about making an announcement over the air. In fact, I had not even referred to the subject as a spaceship because I didn't know what it was. I thought that perhaps it might have come from Russia, and that it was manned by a crew of German scientists getting data for the first Russian Sputnik, which had been launched about a week before. In other words, Schmidt's own original inclination was to interpret the craft as something wholly terrestrial. And not only that, the story had begun to change. So yeah, Deep State gets involved, story changes. Next section, Schmidt arrested and committed. At this juncture, Schmidt records events that utterly indicate that someone somewhere did not like what they were hearing coming out of Kearney, Nebraska, and that they took immediate steps to discredit both Schmidt and his story. I had become aware of the change in the manner of the officials as they discussed my experience. Not only that, but the story that they were now telling no longer sounded the same at all. Suddenly, about 6 a.m., they asked me to say that my experience had not happened at all and that it was a lie. They even asked that I change my story to match theirs. I was dumbfounded at this turn of events. I told them that they could tell whatever story they wanted to, but that I would not change mine unless the truth would jeopardize the security of the United States. They had no answer for that. After refusing to submit to a lie detector test, unless the authorities did as well, Schmidt was informed that by the chief of police that he would be held in jail without a warrant. The next morning, the city attorney visited Schmidt to inform him that they had discovered a half-full can of dark green motor oil in the trunk of his car with an oil funnel, proving that his story was made up. I told him that he would have to think of a better one than that. I brought to his attention the fact that the cans, which he had showed me, had circular holes, and that the can opener I carried in my car cut a triangular hole. Also, the 2 cans in question were the Vidal brand. The oil cans I carried then, which are in my car, are RPM and Skelly. As if to highlight the possibility that the local authorities were being pressured to railroad Schmidt through such clumsy evidence and planning efforts, Kearney received 2 more distinguished visitors. So quick commentary. Psychopaths are bumbling and incompetent. Psychopaths, they occupy positions of power, not quite exclusively, but very heavily. So here's a good example. Okay, so 2 more distinguished visitors. 2 Air Force officials had arrived in Kearney during the night from Colorado. So Colorado to Nebraska, neighboring states, but big states. Especially in the 50s, trip takes a little while, unless you fly. That was fast. The next morning at about 11 o'clock, November the 6th, I was taken over to the police station to talk with them. They recorded my whole experience on a tape as I told it to them. During this session, one of the Kearney officials happened to wonder out loud just how the ship could go straight up when it took off. One of the Air Force men forgot himself for a moment and admitted, "Oh, we know all about that." Given what has been cited thus far, we are permitted to speculate what happened. Schmidt, after he had repeated his story to the local chief of police, and after the latter, and the local officials had verified the story by checking out the landing site, was ordered to be held by the Air Force until they could arrive on the scene and investigate firsthand. In all likelihood, the local authorities, after hearing Schmidt's story, and particularly the detail about German-speaking occupants, had probably contacted the nearest Air Force base to Kearney, which at that time was most likely Offutt Air Base, south of Omaha. At the time, also the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. So Strategic Air Command, they handled all the nuclear bombers that were going to bomb the Soviet Union into oblivion if the nuclear war kicked off. Offutt then most likely contacted the North American Air Defense Command in Colorado Springs, NORAD for short. While NORAD would not be officially founded until May 12th of the following year, most likely a skeletal command structure was already in place in Colorado. At any rate, regardless of how the contact between local officials and the Air Force was actually made, the fact remains that the Air Force showed up very quickly and doubtless exercised a great deal of influence in what happened next to Schmidt, for he found himself hauled before a mental competency board on November the 7th and committed to a psychiatric hospital in Hastings, Nebraska. After intervention from his employer and family, who both attested his mental worthiness, Schmidt was finally released. But the damage had been done. Schmidt's story, which he refused to retract in spite of pressures to do so, was discredited. And this raises the possibility that the rest of Schmidt's accounts of subsequent encounters, which partake so little of the same matter-of-fact character as the first half of his story, and which include many spectacular and far-fetched elements, was itself deliberately concocted under pressure precisely in order to discredit the first part. Whatever one makes of the Reinhold Schmidt contact affair, however, three things stand out as significant for our purposes. One, it was a story with a clear statement of contact with German-speaking occupants of a UFO. Two, that UFO represented a technology clearly terrestrial, as evidenced by Schmidt's own descriptions of it, of its human operators, and of the very human identifiers of Arabic and Roman numerals on some of its equipment, and as well by Schmidt's own inclination not to identify it as an extraterrestrial spacecraft, but as Russian in origin. And three, the U.S. Air Force clearly was concerned about the story, since it took self-evidently strong but covert measures to pressure Schmidt to change his story, and when that failed, by discrediting it by having him involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. In this respect, the U.S. military's reaction to Schmidt's story is of a piece to its reaction to Roswell, which, as I have stated in my books Reich of the Black Sun and the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, may have been the crash of something exotic, terrestrial, and Nazi. For the crash of such a craft, able to enter sensitive American airspace with impunity, would have sent the American military into a tailspin of panic, for it meant that someone on Earth was continuing a line of development of wartime Nazi technology, independent of any victorious allies. It is as if Reinhold Schmidt had either concocted a fictitious or participated in an actual event to corroborate the assertions of Wilhelm Landig's science fiction novels. So again, Wilhelm Landig, he was an SS veteran of World War II, a science fiction author, and he kind of led a sort of a spiritual cult. But he didn't write these he didn't start writing them for more than another 10 years, till about 1970. So it is as if Reinhold Schmidt had either concocted a fictitious or participated in an actual event to corroborate the assertions of Wilhelm Landig's science fiction novels. There was just one problem. They hadn't been written yet. So these sci-fi novels are, again, about a continuation of the SS in the Nazi Party, and they have space-age technology far superior to either the West or the Soviets. All right, and one last section here. The Carol Rosen affidavit in interpretive context. So Carol Rosen, Dr. Carol Rosen, was an associate, a longtime associate of Wernher von Braun, who was a Nazi rocket scientist who was brought to America. He became the first head of NASA. Okay. All this casts the affidavit of Dr. Carol Rosen, longtime American associate of Nazi paperclip rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, in a new light. Rosen claimed that von Braun told her that prior to his death in 1973, the world's elite had a long-range plan for the control and manipulation of the population in response to various perceived enemies. The strategy that Wernher von Braun taught me was that first, the Russians are going to be considered the enemy. Then terrorists would be identified, and that was soon to follow. Then we were going to identify third world country crazies. Now we call them nations of concern. But he said that would be the third enemy against whom we would build space-based weapons. The next enemy was asteroids. Now, at this point, he kind of chuckled the first time he said it. Asteroids. Against asteroids, we were going to build space-based weapons. And the funniest one of all was what he called aliens, extraterrestrials. And look where we are today. All right, let me finish this up. In the light of the foregoing discussion, however, von Braun's alleged statements not only begin to acquire the ring of truth, but also raise the specter that he knew something from long ago. Something connected with the secret projects underway in Nazi Germany. His remarks to Rosen raise the distinct possibility that any such massive ET contact will in fact be a massive deception planned and orchestrated by humans and based upon exotic, though quite secret technology, and made in aid of a sinister ideology, Nazism. All right, some conclusions. And then we're done. So what do we have? In the first instance, the Allied failure to demand a representative of the Nazi Party to surrender and their failure to demand that it abolish itself afforded a clear loophole, not only legally, but more importantly, imaginatively, for the post-war neo-Nazi movement to claim, on the basis of that omission, that the party had survived the war, battered to be sure, but intact. So what that's saying, there are strong suggestions that the Nazis as an organization survived because they never surrendered in the document that ended World War II in Europe. But then they created their own smokescreen. So they allowed sort of conspiracy theories and wild stories and fantasy stories to be created to conceal their real movements. So pretty genius. In the fertile soil of that opportunity, aspects of the original esoteric influences at work within the party, and more particularly within Himmler's SS, grew to encompass the myth of Nazi survival and to elaborate it, as attested by Landig's novels, with a detail breathtaking and fantastic in its scope and particulars. This elaboration, as was seen, included the following assertions. 1, that the Reich government survived the war and that the Nazi Party had never surrendered. 2, that it is based in itself in Latin America. 3, that secret bases were maintained, staffed by German scientists and former SS and military personnel in remote polar regions and remote areas of the Andes Mountains. Now, quick commentary, this is interesting. In the 1930s, the Nazi Party bought basically a giant parcel of land in Argentina, in the foothills of the Andes Mountains, so on the eastern side of the range, called Bariloche. This thing was the size of Massachusetts. I've actually met people who lived there, and they had really weird stories about how, yeah, they were born in Germany and lived there as little children. Then they went to England, and they went to Argentina, and I asked, "Oh, do you live in Bariloche?" And they were just very open, and they said, "Oh, yeah, oh, you know Bariloche?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I've read about it." And then they moved to Canada, and then eventually the United States. So I met these people, and so this Bariloche had a nuclear laboratory. It had like reactors and uranium refiners, and had some really sophisticated scientific research capabilities. And then Chile still has German towns up in the Andes Mountains, still populated by a vast majority Germans. And this is interesting when you look at how when Chile was taken over by a socialist government for a few years in the 1970s, the CIA was very quick in retaking that country and overthrowing that government led by Salvador Allende, and replaced him with Augusto Pinochet, who was, CIA sponsored. And again, CIA was half Nazi when it was founded, half Nazi / German. Okay. 4, that these bases also continued to pursue a line of technological and scientific development of exotic technology tied to advanced propulsion and aircraft, i.e. flying saucers, free energy, and the ultimate doomsday weapon. That the organization had internationalized Nazism. 5, that the organization had internationalized Nazism while retaining a solidly German core but welcoming new ethnic elements, particularly Muslim Arabs and various Oriental groups. And finally, number 6, that the geopolitical agenda of this group was to create a third bloc of nations, so third bloc outside of the US and its allies in the Soviet Union. So, communist and non-communist. And, you see this as, there was the non-aligned movement in the Arab world and in Eastern Europe. So like Yugoslavia, Iraq, Egypt, Libya. Yeah, not so much Egypt, more, Iraq, Libya, Yugoslavia, Syria, some others. Ba'ath Party was big into being non-aligned, possibly connected to these Nazi International. Okay, 6, the geopolitical agenda of this group is to create a third bloc of nations in distinction of the two superpowers in conjunction with the creation of an extraterritorial, so, not bound to a single territory or not even having territory at all necessarily. An extraterritorial Nazi state that the continued independent development and monopolization of the above-mentioned advanced technology was crucial to that geopolitical agenda. As Landing indicates in the subtitle of his first novel, its main plot was full of realities. How many of these realities are true, and to what extent, is the subject of the rest of this book. And the answers are not only surprising, but indeed supremely unsettling. So, Nazi International by Joseph P. Farrell. Pretty fascinating. Dr. Farrell, he's also found evidence, and this is actually people from, say, like Polish intelligence have found evidence that saucer craft were actually being developed in the 1920s by the Thule Society, which was basically the founder and forerunner of the Nazi Party. So in the 1920s, as early as 1922, they were building these saucer craft. And in the 1930s, the first one was actually flown in, I think it was like 1934 in Brandenburg. So a region of Germany near Berlin in Eastern Germany. So pretty fascinating stuff. I think the Nazis never went away. And I think they've been manipulating the world. I think basically the Allies declared victory after World War II out of embarrassment. Because if it was ever admitted that the Nazis got away, they would have had like, revolutions on their hands. So pretty interesting. Um, so you had this encounter, this UFO encounter with a crew of Germans. I think this was early on before there was an ability to, either cloak themselves somehow as gray aliens or create, organic gray alien robots or whatever the fuck. But whenever people are abducted by aliens and, probed anally, the ships are always like filthy, like hot and filthy and just disgusting. So it's like, why would beings who, came from hundreds of light years across interstellar space have like filthy, dirty ships? None of it makes any sense. It's all humans doing it. So, pretty interesting. Yeah, the Nazis never went away. And they probably have a lot to do with this fake alien invasion that some people would like to pull off. All right, so this is a long one. I'm out of here. Have a nice one.